comedy, tragedy, melody. I mean, you probably use at least one of these words today,
Ooh,
right?
almost certainly.
Yeah, like you watched a movie, or maybe you complained about a song being stuck in your head. But what you might not realize is that every time those words leave your mouth, you are actually participating in this massive, thousands of years old linguistic fossil record.
It's hiding right there in plain sight.
Exactly. If you look at those words, they all share that exact same phonetic architecture at the end, that oide or ide sound. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the hidden songs embedded in the language that you speak every single day.
Right. It's a fascinating stack of linguistic notes today.
It really is. We are pulling from this incredible record that traces the ancient Greek origins of our modern artistic vocabulary. So we're going to uncover the wild history behind, well, basically all the media we consume.
And the foundational building block for everything we're looking at today is the single ancient Greek suffix, which is oide.
Oide.
Yeah, oide. And in its purest translation, it simply means song.
Just song. Okay.
It's a song. But this wasn't, a static piece of language. It was highly migratory. So as the epicenter of cultural power shifted across the Mediterranean over the centuries, this root traveled from Greece right into the Roman Empire.
Right.
And when it hit Latin, through centuries of phonetic drift and just the natural softening of consonants and vowels as they pass from generation to generation.
As language does.
Exactly. The concept of oid morphed and eventually became the bedrock for our modern English word audio.
I want to pause on that migration for a second because the mechanics of that shift are just fascinating to me. We're going from the literal Greek word for song to the modern prefix for like everything sound related.
Yeah, it's a huge conceptual leap.
It's almost as if the ancient world defined the entire concept of hearing and sound strictly through the lens of musical performance.
Well, that points directly to the sensory reality of the ancient world. I mean, you have to remember, before the invention of recording devices, the only way to experience structured sound was to be in the physical presence of a performance.
Right, you had to be there.
You had to be there. Music and song were the ultimate peak auditory experiences. So the act of singing, the oide, and the act of hearing just became conceptually fused in the language. The root for song naturally expanded to encompass the entire auditory experience.
Which means when we look at words ending in oide or edi, we're essentially looking at ancient DNA hiding in plain sight.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like this marker telling us that whatever concept we're talking about, it originally required a loud physical public performance.
Yes.
So if oide means song, the most logical place to start this journey is probably the ancient amphitheater.
Absolutely. The festival extremes.
Right, the two most famous songs of human emotion.
Yeah.
The classic laughing and crying theater masks.
And if we look at the lighter side of that spectrum first, the word comedy traces back to the Greek word komoidia.
Okay.
This is a direct combination of two elements. You have komos, which means festival, and our foundational root, oide, the song.
A festival song. I mean, that feels incredibly straightforward on the surface.
It does, right? Until you examine what a komos actually entailed in ancient Greece.
Oh.
Yeah, when we hear festival today, we might picture, a highly organized civic event with food stalls and scheduled performances.
Sure, like a local fair.
Right. But the komos was something else entirely. These were the festivals of Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and ritual madness.
Okay, so we're talking about a massive society-wide pressure release valve.
Precisely. The historical record describes these events not as polite gatherings, but as visceral, chaotic street processions.
Wow.
Everyday citizens, not trained professional actors, just regular people, would march through the streets in states of, heavy intoxication.
So it's just a mob.
Basically. They were dancing, breaking social taboos, and singing these wildly farcical, highly satirical folk songs. And these songs were designed to mock authority figures, poke fun at the elite, and just revel in the absurdity of daily life.
So the comedy was literally born in the dirt of the streets, sung by the masses. It's the ancient equivalent of a massive rowdy pub crawl, just like deciding to write a musical on the fly.
That is a very accurate comparison.
The sheer anarchic energy of that makes the modern sitcom look incredibly tame by comparison. But the contrast to our next word is jarring.
Oh, very much so.
If the comedy is the wild, drunken street parade, we have to flip the mask and look at the tragedy. And this is where the linguistic record throws a massive curveball.
It really does.
So the notes trace tragedy to the Greek tragodia. That combines oide with Tragos. And Tragos translates to male goat.
The infamous goat song.
Way to goat. Let's unpack this for a second because I am struggling to bridge the gap here.
It's a tough one to wrap your head around at first.
The defining feature of a tragedy is the devastating, inescapable downfall of a protagonist. I mean, it is the heaviest, most sorrowful storytelling we have. How on earth does a narrative about the inherent suffering of the human condition get conceptually tied to livestock?
It creates a massive cognitive dissonance for the modern reader, for sure. But if we dig into how ancient cultures fused their economy, their religion, and their art, it begins to form a pretty cohesive picture.
Okay, listen.
So the source texts outline two primary historical pathways for this evolution, and the first is entirely economic.
Economics, right.
Ancient Greece hosted massive, highly competitive drama festivals. Playwrights would literally battle it out for supremacy in front of thousands of citizens.
High stakes.
Very high. And the theory suggests that the ultimate grand prize awarded to the winner of these prestigious competitions was literally a goat.
which, to a modern ear, sounds like a bizarre consolation prize, like congratulations on writing a masterpiece that brought the entire city to tears. Here's a farm animal.
Right, but that modern bias completely ignores the reality of an agrarian society.
Yeah.
In the ancient world, a prime, healthy male goat wasn't a novelty. It was a highly valuable economic asset.
Oh, I see.
It represented wealth, sustenance, and the ability to expand a herd. Winning the goat was a major transfer of wealth and status to the playwright. So the massive serious plays simply became known colloquially by the prize they commanded.
They were competing for the goat, so the play is the goat song.
Yeah.
Okay, that's incredibly pragmatic. But there's a second theory in our notes that feels, I don't know, a lot more primal.
Yes, the religious theory. And this one is fascinating. We know that these theatrical performances didn't just spontaneously appear, right? They evolved over centuries from deep, solemn religious rituals.
Right.
This alternate pathway suggests that during the early primitive forms of these ceremonies, the chorus, the group of performers responsible for singing the lamentations and hymns to the gods, actually wore goat skins.
Wow. Okay, that dramatically shifts the imagery.
Yeah.
You go from a playwright holding a trophy animal to a group of men draped in raw animal hides, chanting these heavy, sorrowful hymns around an altar.
It's a very different vibe.
It really strips away the polished veneer of theater and brings it back to a visceral, earthy human ritual. The goat song isn't a joke. It's a literal description of the priests.
And that physical transformation is key. Wearing the skin of an animal in ancient ritual was a method of shedding your human identity and stepping into a sacred, elevated state. The tragedy was born from that raw religious space long before it became the polished, philosophical, theatrical performances we study today.
So we've established the genres, the street party, and the sacred ritual. But the sources also dive deep into the mechanics of how these ancient performers actually manipulated their material to keep those massive amphitheater crowds engaged.
Yes, moving from the what to the how.
Right. This moves us from the type of song to the craftsmanship of the singer, which brings us to the word rhapsody.
And when you encounter the word rhapsody today, it carries a very specific emotional connotation. You think of a piece of music that is wildly passionate, unbound, and just free-flowing.
Yeah, Bohemian Rhapsody. It defies traditional rigid structures.
Exactly. But the linguistic root reveals an origin built entirely on strict, deliberate craftsmanship. The Greek rhapsodia combines our song's suffix with the verb raptine, which translates to weave or sew.
To sew a song.
To sew a song. The mechanics of oral history actually required it, because before widespread literacy, wandering professionals known as rhapsodes were the keepers of the cultural record.
Okay.
Their job was to perform massive, sprawling epics like Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. But a single performer couldn't possibly sing a 24-book epic from start to finish in one sitting.
I mean, it would take days. The audience would leave.
Exactly. So the rhapsode had to read the crowd. They possessed an immense mental library of different scenes, character arcs, and battle sequences.
They didn't just recite it straight through.
Not at all. Depending on the audience's mood, the time allotted, and the specific festival, they would pull different fragments from their memory and literally stitch them together on the spot. They were weaving pre-existing threads of narrative into a unique, cohesive performance.
The functional mechanics of that are basically identical to a modern DJ.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, a DJ rarely walks into a club
Yeah.
and plays a single pre-recorded hour-long track. They have a massive library of stems, a vocal hook here, a heavy pass line there. They watch the crowd, and if the energy dips, they pull a new thread and seamlessly beat match it into the current song to keep the momentum going.
Right.
So the ancient rhapsode was essentially meter-matching Homeric poetry to keep the amphitheater hooked. They were the DJs in antiquity.
The beat matching analogy is incredibly accurate, actually, because the rhapsodes relied on the strict rhythmic meter of the poetry, the hexameter, to serve as the connective tissue between disparate scenes.
Oh, wow.
And what is fascinating linguistically is how the definition of a rhapsody completely inverted over the centuries.
How so?
Well, by the time we reached the 19th century Romantic era, composers began writing musical rhapsodies. They stripped away the literal storytelling, but they kept the concept of weaving together wildly different, disparate pieces of emotional music.
I see.
Over time, the focus shifted from the deliberate act of stitching to the chaotic, free-flowing feeling of the final product.
Which brings us to another manipulation of the song, and honestly, one of my absolute favorite terms in this entire record. Parody.
A very relevant word today.
We are swimming in parodies today. It's basically the dominant language of the internet, spoofing a famous movie, mocking a politician's speech. But the architectural root of the word doesn't actually imply humor at all.
No, it doesn't.
It comes from parodia, para, meaning beside or parallel, plus our suffix for song, singing alongside. So my question is, how does singing alongside become the comedy spoofing we know today?
Well, the humor we associate with parody today is actually a byproduct of the ancient performance environment. To understand how singing alongside becomes funny, you have to picture the endurance test that was an ancient Greek drama festival.
Okay, set the scene.
These audiences would sit through hours, sometimes days, of rhapsodes reciting heavy, serious epics about war, death, divine punishment, and the brutal whims of the gods. The psychological weight on the crowd was immense.
Yeah, the cognitive load of processing that much tragedy back to back, it requires some sort of release mechanism.
And that release mechanism was the parodia. It served as a highly sophisticated palate cleanser.
Okay.
After a particularly grueling, serious epic, a poet would take the stage to perform. And the crucial mechanic here is that they would maintain the exact same formal structure, the exact same heavy, dramatic, rhythmic meter, and the exact same serious musical modes of the epic that was just performed.
Right.
They were singing perfectly parallel to the original, but they replaced the grand themes of gods and heroes with completely mundane, ridiculous subjects.
Oh, that's brilliant. So the friction between the high art delivery and the low brow content generates the comedy.
Exactly.
It's like taking the booming dramatic voiceover from a blockbuster movie trailer, keeping the massive orchestral swell in the background, but making the script entirely about someone struggling to assemble cheap furniture.
Yes. But the joke only works if the parallel structure is maintained perfectly. The architectural discipline required to execute a true parody was immense.
Because you had to be a master of the original form to subvert it so accurately.
Right. It wasn't just lazy mockery. It was a structural mirror held up to the epic tradition.
That is so cool. Now, up to this point, our linguistic deep dive has focused heavily on the storytelling and the manipulation of the crowd. But we haven't actually touched on the pure, literal sound of the music itself, or how these words captured the rawest human emotions.
Right. The anatomy of sound.
Exactly. Starting with the most fundamental term, melody.
And melody feels so commonplace today. I mean, we define it simply as a sequence of notes that form a tune. But its origin, melodia, highlights a massive divide between how we consume literature and how the ancients did.
How so?
Melos translates to a musical line or a musical phrase, and the source notes are very clear on a specific mechanic here. Ancient Greek poetry was never designed to be read silently from a page.
Right. The concept of silent reading as a leisure activity didn't really exist.
It was fundamentally an auditory communal experience, and the Greek language itself was highly tonal. The pitch of your voice actively changed the meaning and impact of the words.
Well, that's interesting.
So when a poet performed, the natural spoken intonation of the tonal language, the melos, had to interlock perfectly with the rhythmic playing of the accompanying instruments, the oide.
So a melody wasn't just a tune played on a flute.
No, it was the total unification of human speech and instrumental rhythm into a single cohesive line of sound. Speech and music weren't separate disciplines, they were a spectrum.
But that unification of sound wasn't always used for entertainment. The record introduces a much darker application of this phonetic architecture, the threnody.
Yes. The root threnoidia pairs our song suffix with threnos, which translates directly to lamentation or wailing.
A wailing song. It just strips away all the polish of the amphitheater. It is incredibly raw.
It was a necessary social mechanism. In ancient Greece, a threnody was not a metaphor or a stylized poem. It was an active, collective mourning song performed loudly by a group at a funeral. When a community experiences a loss, the raw emotion can be overwhelming and chaotic. The threnody provided a structured, communal vessel for that wailing. It organized the grief so the community could process it together out loud.
We really don't have organized collective wailing at modern Western funerals in the same way.
Yeah.
But the notes indicate the word survived by migrating into a very specific pocket of modern culture.
Yes, it found its home in modern classical music. Today, composers almost exclusively use the title threnody for solemn, avant-garde orchestral pieces dedicated to the victims of massive, catastrophic tragedies, wars, nuclear bombings, large-scale disasters.
So it shed the literal human wailing, but it retained its status as the ultimate auditory expression of collective human sorrow.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the final emotional term in this section, elegy. An elegy is universally understood today as a song or a poem expressing sorrow, typically for the dead. But if you look at the architecture of the word elegy, E-L-E-G-Y, there is a glaring pattern break.
Yes, there is.
The oide suffix is completely missing. So why is this word sitting in the middle of our song record today?
The linguistic pathway for elegy is incredibly convoluted, which makes it fascinating. You are entirely correct that it lacks the phonetic marker for song. The word derives from the Greek elegia, which itself stems from elegion.
And the notes define elegion in two highly specific ways. It refers to the raw sound of a lamenting sigh, but it also refers to a specific flute-like wind instrument that was played exclusively during mourning rituals.
And that dual definition is the key. It's intrinsically tied to the auditory landscape of grief, even without the literal word for song attached to it. But the evolution of the word requires us to look at the mechanics of ancient poetry.
Okay.
In Greece, and later in Rome, an elegy did not inherently mean a sad poem. It actually referred to the elegiac couplet, which is a very strict mathematical rhythmic meter of syllables.
Also, it's just a structural container. Like a haiku. You can write a haiku about a beautiful spring morning, or you can write a haiku about a devastating breakup. The syllables remain the same.
That is exactly the same principle. Ancient poets wrote elegies about love, political rage, military victories, and yes, death. As long as the syllables fit the mathematical rules, it was an elegy.
Right.
But over the centuries, as languages morphed and classical education shifted, the strict adherence to that specific rhythmic structure faded from popular use. The container dissolved.
I see.
What survived in the cultural memory was the heavy emotional association with that mournful elegian flute that used to accompany the meter. Form lost the battle to feeling. The word evolved to encompass any piece of art dealing with loss and sadness, regardless of its structure.
The emotion completely consumed the definition.
Precisely.
Now, up to this point, every word we have examined has been deeply rooted in action. We are out in the amphitheater watching comedies and tragedies. We are at the funeral pyres listening to threnodies. We are hearing the rhapsodes weave epics. Humanity is experiencing the world out loud.
It's very active.
Very active. But the final section of our source material details a massive fundamental pivot in how human beings interacted with knowledge. What happens when humanity shifts from simply singing about the world to sitting down, categorizing it, and analyzing it in silence?
That's when we encounter the great sibling suffix to oide. If the oide represents the ancient song, then the suffix arology represents the ancient scholar.
Right, words like biology, psychology, technology.
The architecture shifts entirely. The suffix arology derives from the Greek logia, which is rooted in logos. Logos is a massive conceptual term in ancient philosophy, meaning word, reason, or the act of recording.
Yeah.
When a word ends in ology, it signifies a formalized academic study or a written, permanent record of a subject.
The contrast in the mechanics of those two suffixes is striking. Biology is the recorded reasoned study of life. Psychology is the categorized study of the mind. Even the word trilogy, which we use casually for movies, literally translates to a series of 3 recorded written works. If the oide requires the wild, loud musical performance out in the dirt of the street with the goat skins and the wine,
Which sounds like a great time.
right, then the prology requires the quiet scholar sitting in the candlelit library, carefully writing it all down on parchment so the mechanics of the world aren't forgotten. They really represent the 2 fundamental halves of the human experience, the chaotic emotion of the song and the rigorous intellect of the study.
It perfectly maps the evolution of human civilization. I mean, we never lost the need to feel the tragedy or the comedy of our existence, but we gradually developed the intellectual architecture to step back, categorize those experiences, and transmit them through reasoned study rather than just oral performance.
It is an incredible timeline to trace. When you look at the sheer distance these words have traveled to get to your mouth today, it completely reframes your everyday vocabulary.
It really does.
We started with the wine-soaked satirical street marches of Dionysus to build the comedy. We unpacked the agrarian economics and ritualistic animal skins that gave us the goat song of tragedy. We watched ancient performers beat match epic poetry to create a rhapsody and traced the mournful sigh of a flute as it consumed the definition of an elegy. And finally, we tracked the societal shift into the quiet, structured halls of the Logis.
It's quite a journey.
It is. The next time you recommend a great comedy to a friend or complain about a catchy melody, I hope you can hear the faint, chaotic echo of an ancient Greek amphitheater in the background.
It definitely makes the language we take for granted feel incredibly alive. And applying this logic forward actually leaves us with a fascinating, slightly unsettling question to consider.
Oh.
Yeah, we have just spent this time dissecting the hidden cultural obsessions of the ancient world through their suffixes, their endless odes, and their academic ologies. It demands we look at our own vocabulary.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Right. Thousands of years from now, when future linguists sit down to analyze the dominant suffixes of our digital age, our casts, our streams, and our bytes, what hidden obsessions will they think we were singing about?